Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to tell you about some of the work that I've been doing on rare bee species with the goal of relating this to the work that you all are doing on bee monitoring and conservation. So this talk is organized around the following set of questions. So first, in what ways can bee species be rare? At what scales? Second, how many bee species are rare? And third, why are rare bee species important? Fourth, why is it hard to analyze data on rare bee species? And lastly, what can monitoring contribute to the conservation of rare bee species? So I want to start by briefly showing you the type of research we do to give you some context for where our answers to these questions are coming from. So I work at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and along with members of my lab group, we've studied bee communities in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York State for almost 20 years. And we've collected data at 375 study sites, which are shown here on this map. So there are about 500 bee species native to our study region, and the great majority of the species we find out there in the wild are native species. There are only a small number of exotics here. We study bee communities at the community scale, which means when we collect data, it's on the entire bee community at a site. We collect all the individual bees we see, so we get lots of individuals of the common species and few or no individuals of the rare species. And a big strength of our data sets is that almost 99% of our specimens we've collected are identified to the species level. So as I'm sure you are aware, accurate species identification is a huge challenge. Even though here in the East, there are keys to most species, we still need to work with professional taxonomists to get our determinations right. And so my rare species work is entirely reliant on the skill and goodwill of these folks here, for which I'm very grateful. So in terms of the main habitats we work in, one of the best bee habitats in our area is actually presumably not a habitat that bees are evolved to. It's old fields regenerating from agriculture. About half of the plant species typical of old fields here are non-native, but it's actually great bee habitat. And similarly, pollinator restorations in our region kind of reproduce high-end old fields. They use summer and fall blooming plants or open habitats and attract lots of bee species. And then there's a native vegetation in our region, which is deciduous forest. And this is important bee habitat, but only in the spring, which is when most of the forest plant species bloom. So once trees leaf out, it's very shady. It's not great bee habitat. But it does seem that about a third of the bee species native to our region are adapted to forest habitat and are more often found there. All right, so back to our questions. I want to kind of consider these three together in terms of how bee species can be rare, how many species are typically rare, and how important these species are in pollination. So ecologists have known for a long time that in general, and this is true of all taxa, not just bees, that rare species account for most of the biodiversity, most of the species at any one place and time. So ecological communities have a small number of common species, in other words, species, each of which is represented by many individuals. And then there are many, many rare species, each of which is represented by only one or a few individuals. And this statement's true whether you study a community at one place in time, and also when you combine data across places and time. So here I'm just showing you some bee data I collected by net and pan trap in this forest shown here on the left. At one site on one date, and you can see here on the x-axis, the bee species in the community are just ranked, descending order of their abundance. So we have 13 species here, and the number of individuals of each species is shown here on the y-axis, and you can see that one species is by far the most abundant, and then there are few species that are kind of abundant, and then all these rare species. So when you combine data across many places and times, you still get the same kind of distribution. Here I've combined data across 13 different forest sites, each of which I sampled in a similar way. And now I'm showing you data I sampled each site 4 times. And you can still see there's one super abundant species and a bunch of pretty abundant species, and then all these rare species. So this is very typical of ecological communities. And And it's also true when you sample bee communities from a single plant species and instead of across all the plant species in a habitat. So this is these data are from a series of papers my lab published on crop pollination by native bee species, where we found a very high diversity of bees pollinating crops, 80 or so wild species altogether. We also found that the native wild bees were doing a lot of the pollination, between 25 and 60% of the pollination for different crops. But really a small number of common bee species were doing the great majority of the pollination. And you can see here for watermelon flower, here for watermelon, a couple small number of 5-ish or so common species for cranberry, and also for blueberry. So what we conclude then so far is that even when you have high bee biodiversity, like we have in our study system, a small number of bee species account for most of the individual bees that you see. And logically, these common species will be doing most of the pollination because they will account for most of the visits to flowers. So there are lots and lots of rare species, but they just may be too rare to be doing much of the pollination. Sometimes there are only one or a few individuals recorded. So to take a closer look at which species are most important, the most important crop pollinators, in this work, we found that Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, which is a superabundant species, was actually the most important crop pollinator for both watermelon and cranberry, and it was somewhat important for blueberry. So this is a pretty weedy species. It's easy to find not only in agricultural areas, also even in major cities. So this species has very high ecosystem service importance, but very low conservation importance. However, the way that ecologists think about rarity, which are the species that are the least abundant within a community or within a habitat, isn't really the way that the conservation world thinks about rarity. So for conservation, what matters for rarity is at a larger scale. Is a species rare at the state level, at the national level, at the global level? And we don't really have good info on this for bees. So we largely lack range and density maps for bee species other than Bombus. And just to make that point, I've pulled some figures off NatureServe. So this is a pretty common bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. Bee biologists believe it's declining at the national scale, so it's definitely a species of concern, and it's ranked that way in a couple states. You can see the red here is critically imperiled, the orange is imperiled. These are just the NatureServe rankings. But you also note it's still unranked, and this is no status rank across much of its range, and you sort of get the impression that it hasn't been studied in a lot of these parts of its range. So this is a more typical species, a less well-known species, and this is just showing sort of a more typical NatureServe map that, you know, clearly this species, we really don't know what is going on with it. And in fact, most of the great majority of these species on NatureServe, if they show up at all, are listed as not ranked due to lack of information. All right, so since we couldn't just look this information up, but we wanted to know what bee species were rare at a regional scale within our study system, we evaluated that ourselves. So we evaluated regional rarity for about 500 bee species using data from my lab group that we've collected, and also from local museums within our study region, primarily from the American Museum of Natural History. So altogether, we had data from 2,800 sites. And we defined rare species. We evaluated about 500 bee species. We defined a rare species as those that were found at less than 5% of the sites. The number of sites that the most common species was found at. The most common species was Bombus impatiens. So a rare species by our definition is one found at 5% of the number of sites that Bombus impatiens was found at. So this approach gives us a different perspective on rarity. For example, consider the case of a plant species specialist. So you don't really encounter plant specialists that often if you just search a region randomly. But if you search their host plant during bloom time, the specialist can be super abundant. So species like this are sort of rare in space and time, but they're common in a particular place, namely on their host plant and a particular time when the host plant is blooming. So a host specialist could be rare at the regional scale, but still abundant enough on its host plant to be an important pollinator. And in fact, that's what we found when we went back to our crop data. Here are the data on cranberry again, and now I'm showing, and the orange bar here is Millet Americana, which is quite a rare bee species on a regional or a national scale, but it's a specialist on Vaccinium, and it's one of the most important pollinators of cranberry, and these are in, big commercial cranberry bogs. So it's basically a cranberry specialist, and presumably the agriculturally grown cranberry provides a great resource for it as well. And now I'm showing you a similar situation on blueberry. There were 2 species that show up as rare on a regional scale that were among the most important pollinators of blueberry. It's Colites pallidus and Haberpoda laboriosa, both also Vaccinium specialists. So one important thing to mention from this study, though, is we have a somewhat unusual situation here in that we're growing a native plant species as a crop. So highbush blueberry and cranberry, both native plants in our region. Usually crops are not native plants. So it really remains to be seen how often this is the case, that key crop pollinators are species that are themselves regionally rare. All right, so there's another way that rare species can be important in crop pollination, and that's if they pollinate a site where the more common species that would normally be pollinating that crop are absent. So this sort of mechanism would only show up if you looked on a site-by-site basis. Previously, I've shown you data that were lumped for all sites of a given crop plant, but now I'm going to show you analyses of those same data sets on wild bee pollination of watermelon, blueberry, and cranberry, but now the data are broken down by site, and here I'm just showing you all 48 sites that we actually studied here. They're kind of spread out between the cities of New York and Philadelphia. So I'm going to talk you through this figure because it really contains a lot of the information from what we actually found. So in this figure, on the x-axis, we have each site in each year. So each of these bars represents a site in a particular year, so we call it site years. And then the y-axis is all the pollen that was delivered to the watermelon flowers at that site in that year. So the y-axis is number of pollen grains, and the different colors are the different bee species. So you can see this legend here with very diverse, lots and lots of bee species pollinating watermelon. And basically the height of the bar here shows how much pollen a given species deposited. So they're organized so that the species depositing the most pollen are the bottom here, the biggest bars, and this blue-green species is Bombus impatiens. But you can see at some sites, there are different species that are the most important pollinators. And then these little tips here, all these colors at the tips are species, many of them rare species that maybe didn't deposit that much pollen, but there are lots of species each depositing a little bit of pollen. So in this analysis, we considered all the species that were needed at a given farm in a given year to reach a threshold level of pollination, and that threshold level is this black bar here. So that's kind of the amount of pollination that we were saying each site needed. All the species that sort of are below this bar, we were defining as important species. So if a farm didn't get enough pollination, it needed all its species, including these rare species that really individually were not contributing very much. So just to make that point a little more clearly, I'll zoom in here on this low end. So these are rare species, each of which wasn't delivering much pollen, but they were sort of added up as being important because they were at farms that didn't have a lot of these common species that in some places delivered a lot of pollen. And conversely, at the other end, you can see these are farms that had a ton of Bombus impatiens, and they basically met their pollination threshold just with Bombus impatiens. So when we do this analysis, we come up with a conclusion that across all these farms overall, across this large spatial scale, we needed about 75% of the bee species we recorded to meet this pollination threshold, or to try to meet it at all the sites. So this came to a very different conclusion, concluded that rare species are quite important, but again, many of them, in fact, were not delivering a whole lot of pollination. Okay, so the last sort of way of thinking about this question that I want to share with you comes from work done by Dylan Simpson, who's a PhD student in my lab. Up to now, I've been showing you data on pollination of particular crop species, but of course in nature, in any one place in time, there are lots of plant species that need to be pollinated, not just one. So Dylan used data on bees that were netted from entire plant communities to ask whether bee species that are rare at a site were still important pollinators for particular plant species growing at that site. So here I'm showing you a results figure from his paper. So these are data on bees that were collected from a plant community containing 12 plant species. And the y-axis is a number of individual bees per bee species, just like what we've been looking at before. And the x-axis orders the bee species from the most common to the most rare at that site. So this is the same kind of figure we've been looking at all along. But now we have the bars colored. So the bars that are colored red are bee species that were among the most important pollinators of at least one plant species at the site. And the really important thing to see here is this dashed line, which represents sort of a threshold number that ecologists use to define rarity, within a community at a local scale. We say that any species that constitutes less than 1% of all the individuals at that site, that is a rare species in that bee community. And you can see that there are lots of red bars that are falling below this threshold. So these red bars are bee species that are considered rare in that community, but they're still among the most important pollinators for at least one of the 12 plants. And in fact, overall, 13 of 25 of these, important pollinator species are rare. So I think this paper is really important. It makes the overlooked point that even within one bee community and one place and time, species that are rare at the community scale can be the most important pollinators of particular plant species. And of course, to those of us who know bees, that's not terribly surprising because different bee species sort onto different plants. All right, so I'm finishing up then on this question of why are rare bee species important? I want to be clear that I focus on functional importance, that is, who does the pollination, and I focus on that just because it's basically what my lab does, but I don't think that's the main reason why rare bee species are important. I think they're important whether or not they do much pollination of anything, and really that's just because they are the species most at risk. They're the most likely to be lost, whether that's extirpated or actually going extinct. And this statement here that they are the most likely to be lost is really based on evidence for other taxa because we don't have great data on bees, but it's really common sense that the number of individuals gets down to low numbers before it gets down to 0. All right, so why is it hard to analyze data on rare bees? I'd like to just share 2 examples from my lab's experience of how rare bee species tend to be left out of analyses entirely, even after all that laborious data collection and determination of rare species, because unfortunately, I do think this is something that needs to be considered in setting up a monitoring program. So this paper was led by Nacho Bartimeus. He was a postdoc with me, I guess 8 years ago now. So here we analyze historical changes in bee populations over a 140-year time series. So this had over 30,000 individual bees of over 400 species. We could actually only analyze the time series for 187 of those 438 species because you can only analyze the most common species statistically. You just don't have enough data to do an analysis on the rare species. And encouragingly, only 3 of the 187 species showed rapid recent decline. All 3 were bombus species, and we basically knew that all 3 were declining already. But with respect to the rare species, the best we could do is a sort of, slightly ad hoc categorical thing. So we looked at species that were represented by only 10 to 30 specimens over this whole 140 years. We considered those rare. And there are 87 of those species, and of those, there were 9 of them that hadn't been detected at all in the past 10 years, despite greater sampling effort in the past 10 years. So we considered those to be of concern, but that's, it's a little bit sketchy as analysis goes. And this is from a second project in my lab. This is led by PhD student Andrew Albercott, and the goal here is to analyze changes in wild bee populations over time. So it turns out that we have one of the longer time series data sets in North America because in our watermelon pollination project, we sampled the same farms over an 8-year period. So Andrew is analyzing how bee populations changed over those 8 years. And here this column is just showing for a bunch of different groups of wild bees. The percentage changed between 2005 and 2012. And you can see that most groups declined, some of them by some really big factors. And two issues I want to highlight here because they're likely to be relevant to those of you who are monitoring bee populations over time. So first, even though these are big changes, only 2 of these groups are statistically significant, and that's simply because bee populations are so variable over time that it's really hard to detect trends, even when the trends themselves are pretty big. And second, the rare species don't really show up here very much. So they're lumped in with the common species, and the common species drive the trends, and that's simply the way it has to be, again, because we can't analyze the data on rare species alone. All right, so in conclusion then, I just want to briefly address what can monitoring contribute to the conservation of rare bee species, and this is sort of from a scientist perspective. It's like data that I wish we had, data I look for that aren't there, that prevent my research group from doing some of the papers and studies that we would like to do. And so 3 really big contributions kind of jump out at me. The first is determine what species are rare at the national scale and get that information into NatureServe or some similar online databases, because those databases are kind of the go-to for scientists. It'd be terrific to have these data for bees, and they're really not there right now. Just by way of example, in New Jersey, maybe 5 years ago, I checked NatureServe and there were 40 bee species known from New Jersey. In reality, there are probably like maybe 420 bee species native to New Jersey. And my lab is now working through DEP in collaboration with NatureServe to get our information loaded into NatureServe. So at least we know that the species we've collected in New Jersey are, in NatureServe and known from New Jersey. And I think now they're up to 264 bee species in New Jersey NatureServe. But the point is, like, most states are really we don't have that information. A second big contribution would be to get more information on how bee species are rare. So species can be, there are a lot of different ways species can be rare. So for example, they can be locally abundant, but not in many places, like host plant specialists, for example, or they can be rare whenever they're found. They're always kind of rare, but they're found in lots of different places. And so on. There are other different ways. But the point is that these different ways of being rare have different meaning for ecologists and for the natural history of the species, certainly. They also have different meaning for conservation. And lastly, just developing range maps for more bee species would be super helpful. For example, scientists need to have sort of baseline range map info in order to do analyses related to climate change. All right, so with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking funding agencies that have supported my lab's work, and also acknowledge my outstanding lab group, past and present. As you probably guessed, this is present. And thank you so much for showing up.